In the silent dance of time, ancient Greek tales continue their slow and gentle journey through millennia. These eternal stories, passed down from generation to generation, whisper like faint echoes in grand marble halls, still sounding remarkably familiar, uniting all who heed their wisdom. Allow the day's hustle and bustle to dissolve like the morning mist over the azure waters of the Aegean Sea, and immerse yourself in a world where gods walked among mortals, and every narrative held a kernel of truth, veiled in magic. In the verdant meadows of ancient Sicily, where wildflowers spread across the land, like an exquisite tapestry woven by an unseen artist, a young maiden named Persephone spent her days engaged in an activity that might seem surprisingly mundane. She gathered flowers, but not with the hurriedness one might pluck a common dandelion. No, Persephone moved through these sun-drenched fields like a gentle breeze, her bare feet barely disturbing the morning dew. She knelt beside fragrant clusters of narcissus, whose pristine white petals caught the first golden rays, and with the utmost care selected only the most perfect specimens. Her woven basket gradually grew heavy with hyacinths, roses and violets, which seemed to glow with an inner, ethereal light. The sweetness in the air was almost palpable, a delicate blend of honey and fresh grass, the aroma of a spring morning when everything feels new and full of boundless possibilities. Persephone's mother was Demeter, the mighty goddess of harvest, and together they bestowed upon the world its blossoms and abundance. It was a life filled with peace and predictability, as reliable and comforting as the unchanging cycle of seasons, a life enveloped in a sense of security. However, on that morning, as Persephone ventured further from her usual paths, something unusual caught her eye. A solitary narcissus, incomparably larger and more beautiful than any she had ever seen, grew in a secluded clearing. Its petals seemed to shimmer like precious pearls, and its enchanting fragrance beckoned her forward with an irresistible force, as if someone had called her name. What Persephone did not know, and could not comprehend, was that this flower had been placed there with a specific, sinister purpose. Deep beneath the earth, in caverns so fathomless that sunlight never touched their ancient walls, ruled Hades, lord of the underworld. He was not evil in the way he is sometimes portrayed in tales. He was simply profoundly lonely. Imagine an eternal existence in a place where nothing grows, nothing changes, nothing truly lives. The silence there would be deafening, wouldn't it? Hades had seen Persephone during his rare visits to the upper world, watched her tend to her flowers with such tenderness, and something in his ancient cold heart had stirred. But how could the Lord of the Dead, the King of Shadows, court the daughter of harvest, the very essence of life? How could he bridge the chasm between existence and non-existence, between the brilliance of the sun and the deepest shadow? The moment Persephone bent down to pluck the magnificent narcissus, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. At first it was just a faint hum, like a distant rumble of thunder or the sound of a passing chariot. But then the earth split open with a thunderous roar, like the groan of a colossal door on old rusty hinges, and from the depths rose a chariot drawn by 4 black horses, their eyes gleaming like embers in the deepest dark. Hades himself, cloaked in his dark mantle that billowed behind him, held the reins. With one swift movement he scooped Persephone into his chariot, and before she could even cry out, they were already hurtling back beneath the earth, the chasm sealed behind them as if it had never been there. The only remaining trace was Persephone's scattered flowers and her overturned woven basket, lying forlornly in the grass. When Demeter discovered her daughter's disappearance, her grief was unlike any the world had ever known. It is a known fact that when profound grief takes hold, individuals often lose all desire to engage with life. They refuse to eat, to clean, to care for familiar things. This is precisely what happened to Demeter, but on a scale that affected the entire earth. She ceased caring for the crops. She stopped sending down the rains. She ceased coaxing seeds to sprout in spring. The world began to descend into cold and barrenness. Leaves yellowed and fell from the trees, but no new ones appeared. Grass withered. Flowers died. Even the olive trees, sacred to the gods, began to drop their fruit before ripening, portending widespread famine and devastation. Meanwhile, deep in the underworld, unexpected events unfolded. Persephone, having overcome her initial shock and fear, began to notice surprising things in her new home. Hades' palace walls were encrusted with gemstones that caught and reflected the dim light in a way that mimicked a scattering of stars. Underground rivers flowed, creating their own unique music, and in gardens where the soil was rich with minerals from the earth's very heart, strange, unseen flowers of breathtaking beauty grew. Hades himself proved not to be the monster she had expected. He spoke softly, almost shyly. He brought her food she had never tasted, fruits that grew only in the earth's depths, sweet and unusual to the taste. He showed her the asphodel meadows, where the souls of the ordinary dead wandered in peaceful dream. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything of her, but merely hoped in silence that she might understand the reason for his actions. Yet, despite all this, Persephone longed for the sun. She missed her mother. She yearned for the feel of warm earth beneath her bare feet and the morning songs of birds. However beautiful the underworld was, it was not her home. Above ground, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Without Demeter's care, people began to suffer from hunger. Other gods pleaded with her to restore the earth's fertility, but she was unyielding. "Return my daughter to me," she replied, "and then the world will bloom again, but not before." Zeus, king of the gods, finally had to intervene. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, to the underworld to negotiate. Hermes found Hades sitting quietly in his garden with Persephone, neither speaking, simply existing in that strange, timeless state people find themselves in when trying to process something complex. "She must return," Hermes gently told Hades. "The world above is dying." Hades slowly nodded, knowing this moment was inevitable. Then he looked at Persephone with eyes that reflected all the sorrow of the earth's depths. "I understand," he said. "But ask her, has she eaten anything while she was here?" This was a question of paramount importance, for there was an ancient law. Anyone who tasted food in the underworld would be bound to it forever. Persephone lowered her gaze to her hands. That morning, while strolling through Hades' garden, she had seen a pomegranate tree laden with fruit. The pomegranates were unlike any she had ever seen, dark red like precious jewels, each seed gleaming like a tiny ruby. Almost without thinking, she picked one and ate 7 of its seeds. They tasted like concentrated sweetness, like the very essence of all fruits ever grown. 7 seeds, such a seemingly small thing, capable of altering the fate of the entire world. Because of those 7 seeds, Persephone could not return to the upper world forever. However, Hermes, known for his cleverness with words and his skill in negotiation, found a compromise. For a portion of each year, 1 month for each seed she had eaten, Persephone would remain with Hades in the underworld. For the remaining months, she would return to her mother and the world of sunlight and lush growth. And so it was decided. When Persephone returned to the surface, Demeter's joy was so immense that flowers instantly bloomed wherever her daughter's feet touched the earth. Spring blossomed like contagious laughter, and summer followed with its abundance of growth and warm breath. But when it was time for Persephone to return to the underworld, Demeter's grief brought autumn when leaves changed colour and fell, and winter when the world rested under blankets of snow. It is said that in the underworld, Persephone became a full-fledged queen. She learned to help Hades judge the souls of the dead fairly. She tended to the underground gardens which bloomed with flowers unseen by any living person, and gradually she developed a tender affection for this quiet, thoughtful god who had so dramatically disrupted her life, but treated her with such gentle respect. When spring returned each year, Persephone emerged from the earth like the flowers themselves, bringing with her a memory of the depths and darkness that made the sunlight even more precious. And Demeter welcomed her daughter home with such joy that the whole world celebrated with blooming trees, singing birds, and the sweet scent of new grass. Even now, thousands of years later, this ancient drama can still be observed in the unchanging cycle of seasons. Every autumn, as the leaves begin to change their attire, Persephone prepares to return to her underground kingdom. Every winter, bare. Branches and dormant seeds await, like Demeter, the return of spring. And when the first crocus breaks through the snow, it is as if Persephone herself is coming home, heralding the awakening of the world. Doesn't this make you wonder what other old stories might be hidden in the everyday rhythms of the world around us? What tales do the seasons themselves still tell? Speaking of stories hidden in everyday expressions, do you know where the phrase describing someone having an Achilles heel comes from? This phrase is used when someone, despite their great strength or talent, has one small but critical weakness. The story behind these words begins with immense maternal love and a desperate attempt to protect a child from a fate a mother could not imagine. Thetis was a sea goddess, beautiful and wise, with hair flowing like ocean waves and eyes reflecting the depth of underwater caves. Having married the mortal king Peleus and given birth to a son, she loved this child with all the fierce, instinctive protectiveness that mothers have felt through the ages. But being a goddess, Thetis could see glimpses of the future, and what she beheld filled her with horror. Her son, Achilles, would grow to be the greatest warrior who ever lived. He would be swift as the wind, strong as a storm, skilled with sword and spear beyond any mortal. Poets would sing of his deeds for thousands of years, but, alas, he would die young, slain in battle, still in the prime of his youth. Thetis, holding her tiny son, felt his minuscule fingers grasp her hand and watched his serene infant sleep. How could she accept that this precious child was destined for such a fleeting and harsh existence? She could not. She had to try to rewrite his destiny. And so one night, when the palace slept and even the owls were silent, Thetis carefully wrapped her baby in soft blankets and carried him to the banks of the river Styx. This was no ordinary river. It served as the boundary between the world of the living and the underworld of the dead. Its waters possessed a unique power. Anyone bathed in the river Styx would become invincible, protected from all harm. The river was dark, like bottomless night, yet surprisingly gentle in its warmth. It flowed silently, like a stream of liquid silence. Thetis waited until the water reached her waist. Then, holding her breath and whispering prayers to any gods who might hear, she dipped her son into the miraculous currents. However, when holding an infant, one must hold him firmly, so he does not slip. Thetis held Achilles by his heel, her fingers securely gripping his tiny ankle. The waters of the Styx covered every part of the child's body, except for that single tiny spot where his mother's hand protected him from the river's touch. When she lifted him, infant Achilles was no longer entirely mortal. His skin had become like the strongest armor, capable of deflecting any blow. No sword could wound him, no arrow could pierce him, no spear could strike him. Thetis had achieved her goal in protecting her son, or so she believed. Achilles grew up precisely as the prophecies foretold. He was tall and mighty, with hair the color of ripe gold, absorbing the sun's rays like summer wheat fields. He could run faster than horses, fight longer than any other warrior, and his unparalleled mastery of weaponry was like a deadly symphony. When he moved across the battlefield, opponents fled before him like leaves before a hurricane. But he was also something more. He was merciful to the weaker, loyal to his comrades, and surprisingly delicate for such a fierce warrior. He played the lyre virtuously, composing hymns about heroes of bygone eras. He genuinely cared for his companions and did not hide his tears when any of them were wounded or killed. In another world he might have been remembered as much for his compassion as for his courage in battle. When the Trojan War began, a conflict that lasted 10 long years, all the bravest heroes of Greece sailed across the wine-dark sea to fight. Achilles went with them, leading his own contingent of warriors called the Myrmidons. They were fiercely loyal to him, not only because he was invincible in combat, but also because he treated them with respect and shared all hardships with them. For 9 years, Achilles was exactly what you would expect an invincible fighter to be. He participated in countless battles, always remaining untouched, while opponents fell around him like wheat under a scythe. His fame spread until the mere mention of his name made enemy forces hesitate. But then something happened that revealed another facet of Achilles' nature, the deeply sensitive part of him. His most loyal companion, Patroclus, was killed in battle by Hector, Troy's most valiant defender. Patroclus was more than just a friend. He was like a brother, someone who penetrated to the very core of Achilles' soul, beneath all that impenetrable exterior. Achilles' grief struck like a natural disaster. He wept so intensely that his mother heard him from her underwater dwelling. He refused food and sleep. He cut off his magnificent golden locks and threw them onto Patroclus's funeral pyre. And then, consumed by a rage that was truly love twisted beyond recognition, he sought out Hector and challenged him. The battle between Achilles and Hector was like a grand confrontation between a storm and an unyielding mountain. Both were supremely skilled. Both were undoubtedly brave, but only one possessed the protection of the waters of the Styx. Hector fought heroically, but in the end, Achilles' spear found its mark, and Troy's valiant guardian fell. What Achilles did next revealed both his human nature and his immense grief. Instead of showing Hector's body due respect as befitted a noble adversary, he fastened it to his war chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy. It was a sacrilegious act that shocked both armies and even angered the gods. For several days, Achilles continued this mournful ritual, driving his chariot around the walls of Troy, while Hector's family watched in horror from the city's battlements. It seemed that by desecrating Hector's body, he could somehow avenge death itself for taking his friend. But eventually, Hector's father, old King Priam, did something that required courage far beyond any battlefield attack. He appeared alone in Achilles' tent in the middle of the night, unarmed and without an escort, to beg for the return of his son's body. The old king knelt before the warrior who had killed his child, speaking not as a ruler to an enemy, but as a parent to another human, who understood the bitterness of loss. "I have done what no mortal has dared," Priam said softly. "I have stooped to kiss the hands of the man who killed my son." Something in those words pierced through Achilles' veil of rage and grief to touch his soul. He looked at this old man broken by sorrow, and imagined his own father, who would one day mourn him just as inconsolably. Then he wept, but these were not the angry tears of fury, but cleansing tears, imbued with universal human pain. He returned Hector's body to Priam, and declared a truce so that Troy could properly mourn its great hero. This was one of Achilles' most noble acts, showing that even the greatest of warriors ultimately remained merely human, capable of being moved by compassion. But the war continued, and relentless fate had not forgotten its claim on Achilles. In the final battles before the walls of Troy, as he fought with his usual unmatched skill and fearlessness, an arrow struck him. It was fired by Paris, Hector's brother, known more for his beauty than his bravery. Normally, such an arrow would have harmlessly bounced off Achilles' impenetrable skin, but this arrow, guided by the hand of the god Apollo, found the only vulnerable point on Achilles' entire body, his heel, the very spot where his mother's fingers had protected him from the waters of the Styx. It was such a tiny target, such an improbable wound, but it was enough. The greatest warrior of all time fell because of his heel, the one place where his mother's protective touch had left him mortal. In attempting to save her son from his fate, Thetis had inadvertently created the very Achilles' heel that foretold his doom. On his deathbed, Achilles thought not of his countless triumphs or undying glory, but of ordinary joys, of the feel of sunlight on his skin, the melody of his loyal friend Patroclus' laughter, the songs he had left unwritten. He thought of his mother and cherished the hope that she would realize he had striven to live a life that honored the existence she had given him, even if he could not prolong it as long as she wished. The story of Achilles serves as a reminder that our greatest strengths and our most profound vulnerabilities often spring from a single source, the love of those who protect us. All protection has its limits. Every gift comes with a certain price, and sometimes what empowers us also makes us susceptible to pain. Even now, when we speak of someone's Achilles' heel, we recall this age-old wisdom. Everyone, however indestructible they may seem, has that tiny spot where the arrows of fate can reach. Perhaps it is not so much a weakness as an inherent part of human nature. The arrows of fate that struck Achilles were not the only ones to forever transform the course of history. Sometimes love itself can prove to be the most lethal arrow of all, as discovered by a young singer named Orpheus at what should have been the pinnacle of his earthly happiness. Orpheus possessed a talent beyond all ordinary comprehension. When he drew sounds from his lyre and sang, flowers bloomed regardless of the season. Rivers altered their course to flow closer to his music. Wild beasts sat nearby in serene tranquility, lions alongside lambs, hawks beside mice. They all listened with the same mesmerizing bliss one might feel when someone hums a cherished lullaby. Even trees uprooted themselves and moved closer to hear him play. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing ancient oaks shuffling like colossal yet gentle giants, their foliage whispering in time with a distant melody. Such was the power of Orpheus's music. It transformed the impossible into the natural, and the miraculous into the everyday. When Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, a wood nymph with eyes like clear spring waters and a laugh like the chime of crystal bells, his melodies seemed to gain even greater beauty. He composed music that captured the play of sunlight in her dark locks, rhythms that harmonized with her graceful movements through the meadows, harmonies that expressed all the magic he felt just watching her tend to injured birds or gather wild honey. Their wedding day was flawless, in a way that makes one believe in the inherent goodness of creation. The ceremony took place in a grove where wildflowers formed natural circles, as if the earth itself had decided to join the celebration. Orpheus performed a song he had created especially for the momentous occasion, and as his voice soared and dipped, butterflies circled the newlyweds like living confetti. As the sun began to set, and the day's celebrations gradually subsided, giving way to the peaceful weariness that inevitably follows, perfectly lived time, Eurydice decided to stroll through the blooming meadow. She wanted a few moments alone to fully experience and absorb her happiness, to let it settle deep within her like sweet honey soaking into warm bread. She walked barefoot on the soft grass, her wedding wreath of delicate wild roses still gracing her head, when she suddenly felt something stir beneath her foot. It was a snake, disturbed from its evening rest, and it swiftly plunged its fangs carrying deadly venom into the maiden's ankle. Eurydice managed only to whisper Orpheus's name, before collapsing lifelessly amidst the very flowers that had so recently witnessed her joy. By the time Orpheus, frantic with a premonition of disaster, reached her, she had already departed the world of the living. Her hand still held warmth in his, and her face remained serene, but everything that made her Eurydice, her ringing laugh, her gentle teasing, her habit of humming softly to his lyre, all of it had vanished, dissolved like morning mist. For 7 long days and 7 moonless nights, Orpheus remained by the body of his beloved Eurydice, pouring out songs of such unbearable grief that, legend has it, even unfeeling stones wept as they listened. His music had always possessed an astonishing power over the natural world, but now it expressed a pain so pure and all-encompassing that it seemed to tear holes in the very fabric of existence. Friends and relatives, grieving alongside him, implored him to eat, to sleep, to distract himself from his sorrow for a moment to care for himself. But Orpheus was deaf to their pleas. How could he eat when the person who gave taste to his entire life was gone? How could he close his eyes when every dream was filled with music he could never again share? And then, finally, an idea flashed in his grief-stricken mind, an idea so reckless and perilous that only one completely consumed by despair could conceive of it. He intended to descend into the realm of the dead itself, into the underworld, and persuade Hades to return Eurydice to him. No living creature had ever entered the abode of shadows and returned. However, Orpheus had his art, his music, and it, as was known, had always been capable of working the unthinkable. The entrance to the underworld was hidden deep within a cavern, so vast and dark that the sun's rays never touched its furthest reaches. As Orpheus descended deeper, drawing melodies from his lyre to light his way, the familiar sounds of the realm of the dead gradually fell silent. The tormented groans of cursed souls, the fearsome rush of the river Styx, the clang of massive gates, all hushed to heed his wondrous song. Even Cerberus, the dreadful three-headed hound that ceaselessly guarded the gates of the dead, lay down and whined softly as Orpheus played. The monster's 3 sets of eyes, usually blazing with unceasing vigilance, closed like those of a sleeping puppy. When Orpheus finally stood before the majestic thrones of Hades and Persephone, he performed the most important song of his life. He sang of love capable of overcoming death itself, of the unbearable pain of separation, of a world that had forever lost its melody with Eurydice's departure. His song was so poignant, so filled with genuine sorrow and all-consuming love, that for the first time in all eternity Hades could not hold back his tears. Even the Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance whose hearts were believed to be harder than stone, found their cheeks wet with tears they did not remember shedding. Persephone, who understood more than anyone what it meant to be torn from the upper world, leaned forward and whispered something in her husband's ear. Hades slowly nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, just like a mortal seized by deep emotion. "Your music has touched our hearts," Hades said, and his voice held an unexpected tenderness and compassion. "We will return Eurydice to you. However, there is one condition. You must walk out of the underworld ahead of her, and you must not look back until both of you are in the sunlight of the upper world. If you turn to look at her even once before that moment, she will be lost to you forever." This condition seemed simple enough. Orpheus had managed to find his way into the underworld. Surely he could find his way back out. He readily nodded, already imagining the moment he and Eurydice would emerge into daylight and begin their life together anew. The journey back began with joyful anticipation. Behind Orpheus, he distinctly heard Eurydice's familiar footsteps, her soft breathing, the rustle of her wedding dress against the stones. Sometimes she hummed softly along to the melodies he drew from his lyre to light their way, and that sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. But as they ascended higher, and the path grew steeper and more difficult, troubling doubts began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him seemed so faint, so weak. What if he was only imagining them? What if Hades had deceived him, and he was ascending alone while Eurydice remained trapped below? What if she was struggling to keep up, growing tired, falling behind? The closer they got to the surface, the more these fears consumed him. He began to slow his pace, listening intently for every sign that she was still there. Once, When the path was particularly challenging, he heard her stumble slightly, and he had to clench his lyre tightly to keep from turning back to help her. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of ascent, Orpheus saw something that made his heart leap with jubilation. Ahead, a thin strip of sunlight appeared, marking the exit from the cavern. They were almost free. Just a few more steps, and both would be back in the world of the living. But as he approached that strip of light, the doubts that had plagued him reached their peak. The footsteps behind him had become so indistinct that he could barely hear them. What if Eurydice was still trapped in the dark realm behind them? What if she needed his help to cross this final threshold? At the very moment his own feet touched the sunlight, just one step before Eurydice would have been safe, Orpheus turned around. For one beautiful, heartbreaking moment, he saw her. She was there, as beautiful as ever, reaching out towards the light and towards him. But she was still one step inside the boundary of the underworld, and by looking back, Orpheus had broken the condition of her release. "Farewell, my love," Eurydice whispered, and her voice was full of deep sadness, but not an ounce of anger. She understood that he had turned back because he loved her, not because he doubted her. But this understanding could not change the tragic consequences. She vanished, dissolving like morning mist, and this time there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. She simply evaporated, returning to the realm of the dead, and the path behind Orpheus sealed itself as if water closing over a dropped stone. For the rest of his life, Orpheus dedicated himself to creating songs of love and loss, of that terrible space between hope and despair. His music became even more beautiful than ever, but it was also filled with an inexpressible sorrow, carrying the knowledge that some mistakes cannot be undone, and some chances never return. He never again attempted to return to the underworld. Perhaps he realized that Hades' mercy could not be sought twice, or perhaps he understood that some griefs simply must be carried, transforming them into something else through the alchemy of time and acceptance. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice serves as a reminder that love sometimes demands us to do the impossible, such as walking forward without looking back, trusting what we cannot see, or believing promises that seem too good to be true. And sometimes, even when we fail at these incredible tasks, the attempt itself becomes a kind of music that echoes through the world long after we are gone. Sometimes the echoes of ancient stories reach our time in the most unexpected ways. Just as Orpheus's music lived on after his passing, so too has a whisper reached us about a magnificent city, presumed to have vanished beneath the waves long before the dawn of written history. The philosopher Plato first introduced the world to the story of Atlantis in his writings, describing it as a place that existed 9,000 years before his own time. Whether it was historical fact or a kind of thought experiment about the rise and fall of civilizations, we may never know. However, the story he told was so vivid and detailed that people have been searching for Atlantis ever since. According to Plato's descriptions, Atlantis was located on an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This island surpassed Libya and Asia combined in size, and it was arranged in a series of concentric circles, alternating rings of land and rings of water, forming something like a target composed of earth and sea. In the very center of these circles stood the most beautiful city imaginable. The buildings were constructed from black, white, and red stone, quarried on the island itself, and many were covered with copper, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which emitted a warm, golden glow. The palace, situated at the heart of the city, was a true marvel of engineering and art. Its walls were adorned with silver, and its spires gleamed with gold. Inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon, god of the sea, who, legend had it, was the father of Atlantis's first king. The exterior of the temple was entirely covered in silver, except for the spires, which shone with gold, and inside a colossal statue of Poseidon, guiding 6 winged horses, stood so tall that his head touched the ceiling of the enormous hall. But perhaps even more impressive than the city's beauty was its sophistication and advanced development. The Atlanteans created an intricate system of hot and cold springs that supplied water for luxurious baths. They built harbours capable of accommodating ships from all over the known world. They developed agriculture to such an extent that their island yielded 2 harvests a year. The descendants of Atlantis traced their lineage directly from the mighty Poseidon, and for many centuries echoes of the divine essence persisted within them. These people were characterized by perceptiveness, impartiality, and restraint in their aspirations. They valued virtue above material possessions, and profound wisdom above earthly power. Their laws were inscribed on columns of mysterious orichalcum, and their rulers convened alternately every 5th and 6th year to discuss pressing state matters and uphold the unwavering rule of justice throughout their vast kingdom. For countless ages, the Atlanteans prospered under the patronage of this orderly system. Their majestic vessels traversed the boundless expanses of the oceans, reaching distant shores, bringing home valuable knowledge and exotic goods, while simultaneously disseminating their own innovative achievements. The inhabitants of this island were virtuosos in scientific disciplines that for other peoples remained mere vague premonitions. They comprehended the intricacies of celestial mechanics, deeply understood the characteristics of metals, and mastered methods of cultivating plants capable of growing in conditions that other civilizations would have deemed absolutely uninhabitable. However, with the passage of time, the Atlanteans' inner essence began to undergo irreversible changes. The divine spark inherited from Poseidon gradually faded with each new generation, weakened by both alliances with mortals and, likely, the corrupting influence of excessive prosperity and carefree living. Where they once were content with moderate wealth, their hearts were now gripped by an insatiable craving for excess. The former value of wisdom gave way to the veneration of cunning, and their once inherent generosity towards foreigners and neighbours was replaced by greed and a desire to seize foreign lands. This transformation occurred slowly, like a sunset that progresses so subtly one might not notice its subtle shift until suddenly realizing the familiar light has completely changed its character. The Atlanteans began to look beyond their fertile island, seeing not potential allies and trading partners, but only lands to be conquered and peoples to be enslaved. They formed a colossal army and moved to conquer the Mediterranean. Their highly advanced technology and impeccably coordinated strategy made them virtually invincible. One after another, ancient city-states and kingdoms bowed before their irresistible onslaught. However, upon reaching Athens, the city destined to become the cradle of the great Plato, they encountered completely unforeseen resistance. The ancient Athenians, despite a significant numerical disadvantage and technological inferiority, fought with the fierce desperation of people protecting their homes, and with the righteous resolve of those who refuse to bow to tyranny. Against all expectations, Athens not only managed to repel the Atlantean invasion, but also launched a counter-offensive that forced the would-be conquerors to retreat across the seas. It seemed as if the valor and moral principles that the Atlanteans had lost had mysteriously taken root in Athenian soil. However, true retribution befell Atlantis not from mortal adversaries, but from the heavens themselves. Zeus, observing from the heights of Mount Olympus, saw what the once noble Atlanteans had become, greedy, warlike, and corrupt beings, and he decreed that such a civilization had forfeited all right to continued existence. The end came swiftly, within a single day and night. Massive earthquakes shook the island with such force that monumental structures crumbled like children's sandcastles. Volcanic eruptions filled the skies with ash and fiery glow. But most devastating was that the sea itself rose, engulfing all the land. The concentric water circles, once the pride of Atlantis, became giant whirlpools, sucking down ships, buildings, and people. The magnificent palace, the sanctuary of Poseidon, libraries holding centuries of wisdom, harbours that welcomed ships from all over the world, all vanished irrevocably beneath the waves that closed over the island like the pages of a closing book. By dawn, not a single trace remained, except for a boundless, desolate expanse of water. The seas in that area became impassable, choked with thick mud churned up from the ocean floor. Ships that dared to navigate those waters became mired in what resembled liquid earth, and seafarers passed down word that this region remained inaccessible for passage for many generations thereafter. This narrative could well have ended here, fading into oblivion like countless other tales of divine indignation and human folly. However, something about the story of Atlantis captivated people's imaginations in a way that no purely historical account of ruined cities ever could. Perhaps it was the striking thought that such an advanced civilization could simply vanish overnight. Or perhaps the enticing prospect that somewhere beneath the depths, the ruins of this brilliant city still lie, awaiting their hour to be discovered. For centuries, explorers, treasure hunters, and ardent dreamers have tirelessly searched for Atlantis in the most diverse corners of the planet, from the Mediterranean to the vast Atlantic, from the Caribbean to icy Antarctica. Some claim to have found convincing evidence in unusual underwater structures off the coast of Bimini. Others hypothesize that Atlantis is actually just an echo of the memory of Minoan Crete, which was wiped off the face of the earth by a devastating volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami. However, perhaps the true essence lies not in a precise geographical location. Perhaps Atlantis exists not as a physical place, discoverable by ships and diving gear, but as an eternal idea that resurfaces again and again in humanity's collective consciousness. This is the notion of a perfect society that doomed itself through its own triumph, of a civilization that reached unprecedented heights but forgot the fundamental values that initially elevated it to the pinnacle. Whenever a society becomes overly complacent, excessively convinced of its superiority, too ready to impose its will on others through force, the spectre of Atlantis invisibly whispers a warning. Every time we observe the development of technology and abundance devoid of wisdom and self-control, we involuntarily contemplate the very preconditions that are believed to have led to the downfall of the most advanced civilization ever to exist on Earth. Perhaps for these reasons, humanity relentlessly continues its search for Atlantis, not only in the mysterious depths of the ocean, but also in the succession of civilizations' rises and falls throughout the ages. People continue to search for it because they continue to create it themselves. And all of us constantly need a reminder that the price of true greatness is humility, the necessity of remembering our origins and the true purpose for which this grand journey was begun. The quest to reclaim former glory often demands not so much wisdom as unparalleled courage. This is precisely what a young prince named Jason learned firsthand when he embarked on a perilous undertaking for a treasure that seemed utterly unattainable. His epic journey was to lead him to the very edges of the known world, accompanied by heroes whose names still echo in the halls of ancient legends. Jason's story, like many ancient tales, began with treachery within the family. His uncle Peleus cunningly seized the throne that rightfully belonged to Jason's father. Upon reaching adulthood, Jason returned to claim his hereditary rights. However, Peleus, cunning and cruel, made Jason an offer that at first seemed generous, but was actually intended to permanently remove him from the path. "I will gladly cede the throne to you," Peleus said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "But first, you must prove your valor by performing a feat. Bring me the Golden Fleece from Colchis, and then the kingdom will be yours." The Golden Fleece once belonged to a magical ram that had saved 2 children, carrying them to safety on its back, soaring through the air with the lightness of a bird. After the ram was sacrificed to the gods, its fleece, which radiated a brilliance like the sun itself, was placed in a sacred grove in the distant kingdom of Colchis, located on the eastern border of the Black Sea. However, this fleece did not simply rest there, waiting to be plucked like ripe fruit from a tree. It was ceaselessly guarded by a dragon that never slept, never closed its eyes, and never for a moment relaxed its vigilant watch. This was not the fire-breathing, imposing monster typically depicted in fairy tales. This dragon was far more formidable, for it possessed patience, a keen mind, and absolute devotion to its mission. The creature coiled around the mighty oak where the fleece hung. Its scales shimmered, changing shades depending on the light, sometimes appearing golden like the fleece itself, sometimes dark like the shadows in the foliage. Its eyes, like polished amber, watched every rustle in the grove with the focused attention of a predator who commanded all the time in the world. To reach the coveted Colchis, Jason needed not only a ship, but also a crew brave enough to sail uncharted waters, teeming with monsters, hostile tribes, and navigational traps that had claimed countless ships before them. Thus he commissioned the building of a ship named the Argo, and issued a call to heroes to join him on this endeavor, which everyone knew was highly likely to be a one-way journey. The response exceeded all expectations. Heroes from all corners of Greece flocked to join those who would later be known as the Argonauts. Among them was Hercules, the mightiest of all mortals, capable of wrestling lions and diverting rivers. Orpheus was also present, whose enchanting music could charm wild beasts and move stones to tears. Here were the twin brothers, Castor and Pollux, skilled horsemen and masters of fisticuffs, and Atalanta, an unparalleled huntress, capable of outrunning any man, whose arrows always found their mark. Each of the valiant heroes had their own motivations for participating in this daring expedition. Some yearned for undying glory, others for thrilling adventures. Some sought to escape difficulties awaiting them in their homeland, while others rushed towards dreams they themselves could not fully articulate. but all of them unanimously realized that this journey would test them in ways they had never known before. The journey to Colchis took many months, and each leg of it was an adventure in itself. They passed the Symplegades, colossal rocks that periodically crashed together, crushing any ship unfortunate enough to be caught between them. The Argonauts encountered harpies, malevolent creatures with the bodies of birds and the faces of women, who mercilessly and continuously tormented a wise old king, constantly stealing his provisions. They landed on islands where the inhabitants had never before seen strangers, and they had to resort to diplomacy as often as to force to continue their journey. Sometimes the locals were hostile, sometimes they proved helpful, but invariably they harbored a keen curiosity about these heroes who had ventured so far from home on such a dangerous mission. Having reached the shores of Colchis, the legendary ship Argo delivered Jason and his valiant crew to the kingdom ruled by King Aeetes. The ruler's reception was imbued with that peculiar, suspicious courtesy that powerful monarchs usually extend to guests whose role in future events remains unclear. They could be valuable allies or pose a threat. King Aeetes seemed willing to part with the Golden Fleece, but his consent was conditional upon the completion of a series of tasks that many would have deemed impossible. First, Jason had to tame 2 bronze bulls, whose nature was truly fearsome. They breathed fire and possessed hooves of copper. After this, he was to use these fire-breathing animals to plough a field, and then sow it with dragon's teeth. From these teeth, fully armed warriors were to spring forth, whom Jason was obliged to defeat before dusk. This trial was not merely a test of strength, but an elaborate plan to eliminate the hero, which was evident to all. The bronze bulls had already trampled and incinerated all previous daredevils who had challenged them. The warriors born from the dragon's teeth were fierce, impeccably coordinated, and absolutely merciless. It seemed no mortal could survive such conditions. However, Jason found an unexpected patroness in Medea, King Aeetes' daughter, who possessed deep knowledge of magic and healing herbs. From the moment Jason arrived in Colchis, she had observed him closely, and his courage, as well as his obvious dedication to his cause, had stirred her heart. Medea was no ordinary princess, passively awaiting rescue. She was sharp-witted, powerful, and deeply understood forces most people feared even to imagine. Her magical abilities could both heal and harm, protect or destroy, and she decided to use them to help this foreign prince who had travelled so far for what everyone deemed impossible. She gave Jason a miraculous ointment capable of protecting him from the bulls' scorching breath and the blows of their bronze hooves. Medea also revealed to him the secret of defeating the warriors grown from dragon's teeth. It was enough to throw a stone into their midst to make them turn their fury against each other. And, most importantly, she promised to help him bypass the sleepless dragon that guarded the Golden Fleece itself. The trials unfolded exactly as Medea had foreseen. Protected by her magical ointment, Jason managed to harness the bronze bulls and plough the designated field. When armed warriors emerged from the furrows, he, following her advice, threw a stone directly into their ranks, and they immediately engaged in a fierce battle with each other, annihilating themselves completely. King Aeetes was enraged by Jason's success. However, he could not break his public promise. Nevertheless, he had no intention of surrendering the Golden Fleece. A cunning plan was already brewing in his mind, to attack the Argonauts under the cover of night and slaughter them all while they slept. Medea, who knew her father's thoughts better than anyone, warned Jason of the impending betrayal. That very night, she led him to the sacred grove where the Golden Fleece hung on an oak, guarded by the sleepless dragon. The dragon sensed their approach long before they reached the tree. Its enormous head rose from the coils of its body, and its amber eyes stared at them with an expression of malevolent intelligence. It made no sound, no growl or hiss like lesser creatures. Its threat lay in its absolute stillness, in its patient readiness for a lightning-fast strike. Then Medea began to sing, a song in a language older than Greek, perhaps older than any human tongue. It was a lullaby that spoke to the deepest, most primitive parts of the brain, to the parts that held memories of childhood, of feeling safe in loving arms. The dragon's head began to sway slightly, as if it were fighting something it had never experienced before. Its amber eyes, which had never closed, grew heavy. The coils of its body loosened as the muscles, taut for decades, finally began to relax. For the first time in its long existence, the sleepless dragon began to drift into slumber. Jason climbed the oak as quietly as possible, barely daring to breathe as he reached for the Golden Fleece. When his fingers touched it, the fleece felt warm, as if the magical ram from which it came still lived within it. It was surprisingly light and seemed to emit an inner radiance. With the fleece securely tucked under his arm, Jason descended and followed Medea out of the grove. Behind them, the dragon slept, immersed in dreams no creature before it had ever known. The journey home was as perilous as the journey there, now complicated by the fact that King Aegean had sent ships in pursuit to reclaim his daughter and deal with the thieves of his treasure. But that is another story entirely, full of its own adventures and heartaches. What matters now is that Jason accomplished what everyone said was impossible. He acquired the Golden Fleece, a treasure guarded by a creature that never rested, never lost vigilance, never gave anyone the slightest opportunity to approach. Sometimes the most formidable guardian can be overcome not by brute force or elaborate cunning, but by offering it something it has never had. In this case, the simple gift of sleep. The rest that every living creature needs, but which this dragon was denied due to the nature of its duty. It makes you wonder what other seemingly impossible tasks might be accomplished, not by fighting harder or being cleverer, but by understanding what the guardian truly needs and finding a way to provide it. Understanding what drives us to undertake impossible tasks, Hercules knew better than anyone, though this understanding came at a cost that nearly destroyed him. His story reminds us that sometimes our greatest strengths and our deepest flaws stem from the same source, and that redemption often requires far more from us than we think we can bear. Hercules was born with strength beyond anything possible for a mortal. As an infant, he strangled 2 snakes sent to kill him in his cradle, and he did so laughing, as if it were a game. As he grew, his strength grew with him, until he could lift boulders that would challenge a dozen ordinary men. He could wrestle lions with his bare hands, could bend iron bars as easily as you might bend a flower stem. But along with this immense physical strength came a temper that was just as powerful, and far more dangerous. When Hercules was angry, he didn't just raise his voice or storm out of a room as most people do. His rage was like a force of nature, sudden, overwhelming, and destructive beyond measure. For many years, Hercules managed this aspect of his nature. He married a woman named Megara, and they had children. It seemed he had found the peaceful domestic life that might tame the wildness in his heart. He was a loving father, gentle with his children despite his great strength, and a devoted husband who strove every day to be worthy of his family's trust. But the goddess Hera, who had hated Heracles since his birth, because he was the son of her husband Zeus by another woman, decided to destroy this happiness in the cruelest way possible. She inflicted a fit of madness upon Heracles, a rage so complete that he lost all sense of who he was and what he was doing. When the madness finally receded, Heracles found himself surrounded by a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his insane fury, he had killed his own wife and children, the very people he loved most in the world. His strength, which should have been used to protect them, became the instrument of their destruction. The grief and guilt that followed were almost enough to destroy him entirely. For days he sat amidst the ruins of his former happiness, unable to eat, sleep, or even speak. How could he live with the knowledge that he had destroyed everything he ever cherished? How could he continue to exist when what he feared most about himself had proven to be absolutely true? Finally, desperate to find a way to atone for his deeds, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle's prophecy was harsh but offered a thread of hope. Heracles must serve his cowardly cousin, King Eurystheus, for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king demanded. Only by completing this service could he find purification for his terrible crime. King Eurystheus was precisely the kind of man you would expect to be given power over a hero like Heracles, petty, envious, and cruel. He was also clever enough to understand that Heracles' strength made him dangerous, and cowardly enough to wish for the destruction of that strength, rather than its use for any beneficial purpose. So Eurystheus devised a series of 12 labors. Each was designed to be impossible. Each was intended to kill Heracles in a different, horrific way. If the hero somehow survived one task, the next would be even deadlier. The first labor was to kill the Nemean lion, a creature with a hide so thick that no weapon could pierce it. Arrows bounced off it like pebbles. Swords broke against its fur. Spears shattered on impact. Heracles eventually had to strangle the beast with his bare hands. The struggle lasted all day and left him exhausted, but victorious. The second trial that befell Heracles was the slaying of the Lernaean Hydra, a monstrous serpent with numerous heads, each of which, once severed, regenerated in double quantity. With each strike of Heracles' sword, which lopped off one of these serpentine heads, 2 new ones immediately appeared in its place, ultimately leading the hero to confront a terrifying, writhing mass full of snapping jaws and deadly, venomous fangs. To overcome this seemingly insoluble dilemma, Heracles showed ingenuity, instructing his nephew, Iolaus, to cauterize each fresh neck stump with a burning torch immediately after the hero severed a head, thereby effectively preventing its subsequent regeneration. This episode was one of the rare moments when Heracles agreed to accept help in performing his heroic deeds, and it taught him a valuable lesson. Physical might alone is often insufficient. True success also requires insight, wisdom, and the ability to cooperate effectively. The third heroic deed led him into the mountain ranges, where he was to capture the Ceryneian hind, a graceful creature, a deer revered as sacred to the goddess Artemis herself. This mission demanded entirely different qualities from Heracles, not brute force, but exceptional patience and relentless persistence. The hero had to tirelessly pursue this incredibly swift and elusive creature for a full year before he could finally catch it. without causing it the slightest harm. It was this condition, to preserve the animal's life and integrity, that made the task set before him exponentially more difficult and delicate. Each new, subsequent heroic deed presented a unique trial designed to test and develop different facets of Hercules' complex character. Among these tasks were such as capturing alive the colossal Erymanthian boar, cleaning the legendary Aegean stables, which housed countless thousands of cattle and had remained uncleaned for decades, driving away the bloodthirsty Stymphalian man-eating birds, taming the ferocious fire-breathing mares of Diomedes, and retrieving the belt of Hippolyta, the valiant queen of the Amazons. Some of these missions required the hero to develop subtle diplomatic skills, which he had to learn on the job. Others, conversely, called for his cunning and strategic planning, rather than mere brute force. Thus, Heracles, who at the beginning of his journey relied solely on his physical might, gradually transformed, learning to use his sharp mind, his compassionate heart, and, no less importantly, his ability to interact with others. However, the truly grand and most challenging labours still awaited their hour ahead. The 10th mission required Heracles to steal the magnificent cattle of Geryon, a colossal three-bodied giant whose domain lay on the westernmost fringes of the known world. To reach Geryon's distant island, the hero had to cross the boundless expanses of the ocean. It was during this epic journey that he erected the famous Pillars of Hercules, which are today known as the Strait of Gibraltar, thereby marking the furthest boundary reached by human knowledge in the world at that time. The 11th labour sent him to the mysterious garden of the Hesperides, where he was to steal golden apples possessing miraculous properties. These fruits, according to legend, granted immortality to anyone who tasted them, and they were guarded not only by the Hesperides themselves, beautiful nymphs who sang melodiously while tending the trees, but also by a fierce 100-headed dragon named Ladon. To accomplish this incredibly difficult mission, Heracles had to resort to cunning and persuade the mighty Titan Atlas to assist him. Atlas, who was condemned to hold up the sky as punishment for his involvement in an ancient rebellion against the gods, agreed to fetch the apples, but only on the condition that Heracles temporarily take on his impossible burden. Thus, for a brief yet significant period, Heracles found himself standing at the edge of the world, feeling the full weight of the heavens on his shoulders, and it was then that he grasped the true meaning of responsibility that could not simply be shrugged off or discarded. The 12th and final labour presented the most impossible task of all. The hero was to descend into the gloomy realm of the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the terrifying three-headed hound that ceaselessly guarded the gates to the abode of the dead. Until this point, no living person had managed to penetrate Hades' realm and return safely, nor had Cerberus ever been defeated by any hero or monster. However, by this time, Heracles had undergone profound changes, becoming an entirely different person compared to the man, full of untamed rage, who had begun his path of atonement 12 years prior. He had learned true patience while pursuing the elusive Pyrenean hind. He had mastered the art of diplomacy in his encounters with the warlike Amazons, and he had found humility when the weight of the celestial vault rested on his shoulders. Therefore, when he stood before Hades and Persephone, asking permission to attempt to capture Cerberus, he did so with deep reverence and respect, completely devoid of his former arrogance. Hades, lord of the underworld, gave his consent, allowing the hero to attempt the feat, but with one immutable condition. Heracles had to subdue Cerberus using only his own physical strength, without any weapons and without any outside help. This was the ultimate test of all the lessons he had learned over his long years of service. The struggle between Heracles and Cerberus was undoubtedly epic in scale, yet it unfolded surprisingly quietly. There were no deafening roars, no theatrical poses, just a patient confrontation of strength against strength, endurance against endurance. Heracles wrapped his arms tightly around the colossal hound's mighty neck and held on. No matter how fiercely the creature thrashed, trying to break free, and how desperately it tried to shake the hero off. Ultimately, Cerberus realized that this man would not release his embrace, would not give up, would not be intimidated or exhausted. And perhaps with a semblance of respect, the guardian of the underworld allowed himself to be led into the world of the living. When Heracles finally presented Cerberus to King Eurystheus, the cowardly ruler, upon merely glancing at the formidable three-headed monster, immediately granted the hero his long-awaited freedom. Thus the 12 great labours were finally completed. The debt of atonement was fully paid, and Heracles was at last able to live his own life. However, the point is that tasks that deeply change a person leave an indelible mark. Having completed them, you are never again the person who started them. Heracles, who completed the 12 labours, was an entirely different man than the one who began this journey 12 years earlier, consumed by grief and guilt. He learned that true strength does not come from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom that tells you when not to use your power. He realized that the most difficult battles are often fought not against external monsters, but against those internal aspects of oneself that are least pleasant. And he discovered that redemption is not a destination one strives for, but rather the journey itself, a daily choice to use one's talents and gifts in service of something far greater than oneself. The 12 legendary labours of Heracles serve as a powerful reminder that sometimes the very tasks that initially seem designed to utterly destroy us are, in fact, the very trials that profoundly teach us who we truly are and who we can potentially become. The question of our inner potential and who we are capable of becoming was, in Sisyphus's conviction, definitively answered by himself. He steadfastly believed in his exceptional cunning and intelligence, thinking he could outsmart absolutely anyone, including even the Olympian gods themselves. His tragic story serves as an eternal warning. There are contests in which victory brings no benefit, and triumphs that, upon closer inspection, turn out to be merely disguised defeats. Sisyphus, who ruled Corinth, was known throughout Hellas for his exceptional cunning and keen intellect. He not only founded his city, but also brought it to prosperity through a unique combination of visionary strategic thinking and, at times, ruthless pragmatism. He was the type of ruler who always seemed to be several steps ahead of his opponents, capable of finding an advantageous approach or a hidden benefit in almost any situation. However, Sisyphus had one fatal flaw. He simply could not resist boasting about his extraordinary cleverness, even when it would have been much wiser to remain silent and keep his cunning schemes to himself. His behavior was akin to a chess master who cannot resist explaining all his brilliant moves to his opponents, thereby inadvertently revealing his own strategy. Misfortunes began to befall Sisyphus from the moment he became an unwitting witness to an event he absolutely should not have seen. Zeus, the almighty king of the Olympian gods, transformed into a mighty eagle to abduct a beautiful river nymph named Aegina. Her father, the river god Sisyphus, in inconsolable grief, searched everywhere for his missing daughter, and eventually turned to Sisyphus for help. The wisest course of action for Sisyphus in this situation would have been to claim complete ignorance. After all, what mortal ruler would wish to interfere in disputes between powerful gods? However, Sisyphus, blinded by his cunning, saw an opportunity to gain a powerful ally and could not resist the temptation to demonstrate how much he knew. "I saw what happened to your daughter," Sisyphus said to Sisyphus. "Zeus abducted her, but if you wish to obtain this information, I will require something in return. Create a spring of fresh water for my city, and then I will reveal to you where he took her." At first glance, it seemed a truly brilliant deal. Sisyphus, fulfilling his part of the agreement, created a spring of life-giving fresh water for Corinth. Sisyphus, for his part, exposed Zeus's secret crime, and his city gained an invaluable water resource. However, Sisyphus made the classic mistake of naively believing that he could manipulate forces far superior to his own with impunity. Zeus, of course, was extremely displeased to discover that a mortal king had not only revealed his closely guarded secret, but had also set an enraged river god upon him. The Lord of Olympus immediately decided that Sisyphus needed to be taught a harsh lesson about the danger of excessive cleverness turned against one's own good. In response to Sisyphus's audacity, Zeus sent Thanatos himself, personified death, with the task of taking the king and escorting him to the underworld. However, even in the face of the inevitable and ultimate fate awaiting all mortals, Sisyphus could not resist another attempt to outsmart his adversary. When death arrived at the majestic palace of Corinth, Sisyphus greeted her with feigned humility. "I suppose my time has come," he said melancholically. "I am ready to follow you. But first, tell me those chains you carry. How exactly do they function? I have heard they are unbreakable, but I have never had the opportunity to examine them closely." Death, who was evidently proud of her unique equipment, readily agreed to demonstrate their operation. "You see, once these chains are locked, no force in the entire universe can break them. Here, let me show you how they fasten." And faster than Death could realize what was happening, Sisyphus deftly bound Death herself in her own unbreakable shackles. After Death found herself imprisoned in her own unbreakable shackles, no living organism anywhere on Earth could die. This became an unprecedented and profound disruption of the natural cosmic order. At first, Sisyphus rejoiced, experiencing genuine delight in his incredible cunning. He had managed to deceive the very personification of death, accomplishing something no mortal before him had achieved. However, with the passage of time, the horrifying consequences of his audacious actions began to manifest with full clarity. Without death to take the old and infirm, the world steadily filled with unbearable suffering. People destined to find peace in oblivion were forced to continue their existence in agonizing pain and infirmity. Warriors who fell on battlefields could not die, and so they lay there with horrific wounds, unable to heal or find longed-for release. The Olympian gods were not merely indignant, but, far more importantly, deeply concerned. The entire cosmic order rested on the fragile balance of the cycle of life and death. Without death to balance life, the very existence of the universe was threatened. Finally, Ares, the mighty god of war, arrived in the mortal realm of Corinth to restore order and resolve the protracted situation. With his authoritative hand, He freed Death from her heavy chains and personally escorted the cunning Sisyphus to the gloomy realm of the underworld. However, even at this seemingly final defeat, Sisyphus had one more carefully planned trick. Before embarking on his final journey to the world of the dead, he strictly instructed his wife not to perform the customary funeral rites for him. Upon arriving in Hades' realm, Sisyphus immediately lodged an indignant complaint with the lord of the underworld, pointing out this egregious violation of sacred religious law. "My wife has disgraced me," Sisyphus exclaimed with indignation. "She has not seen to the proper funeral, as tradition requires. Can you truly expect me to remain in the underworld when I was not sent here correctly?" Hades, who was always a zealous adherent of strict procedures and rules, agreed that this indeed presented a serious problem. He generously granted Sisyphus permission to return to the world of the living, but only for a brief period, sufficient to organize and conduct his own proper funeral. However, as soon as Sisyphus again set foot on the soil of Corinth, he had no intention of voluntarily returning to the realm of the dead. He lived for many more years, enjoying every moment of life, and proudly recounting how he had twice, not once but twice, managed to outwit death herself. In the end, of course, relentless old age caught up with him, and when he died a natural death, escaping his final fate was no longer possible. But by that time the Olympian gods had already decided that ordinary punishment would not suffice for one who had caused so much trouble and shown such blatant disregard for the natural order of things. Sisyphus was condemned to a very particular form of eternal punishment. He was assigned a task that was to last endlessly, to push a massive boulder up a steep, exhausting hill. The treachery of this punishment lay in the fact that each time he almost reached the summit, the stone would relentlessly roll back down, forcing him to start all over again. Imagine the scene. Sisyphus leans his shoulder against the massive rock, feeling its colossal weight and rough surface, and begins the slow, agonizing ascent up the mountainside. His muscles strain to their limit. His breathing becomes a ragged gasp, sweat streams into his eyes. Step by step, inch by inch, he forces the boulder higher up the slope. As he climbs, he sees the hilltop drawing closer. A faint hope stirs in his heart that this time will be different, that this time he will truly manage to roll the stone all the way to the top. He pushes with even greater force, ignoring the searing pain in his back and shoulders, concentrating all his energy on those last few meters. And then, just as he was about to succeed, the boulder breaks free from his control and tumbles crashing back down. Sisyphus has to watch all his progress vanish. He has to accept that all his incredible efforts were in vain. He has to start this endless process all over again. This punishment was designed to perfectly match Sisyphus's character. He had always been driven by an insatiable desire to win, to be smarter than everyone, to accomplish what others could not. Now he was trapped in a task where victory was impossible, where cunning was useless, where his sharp intellect brought him no advantage. But this is where the narrative takes an unexpected and profound turn. After countless ages of pushing his boulder, something changed within Sisyphus himself. He began to find a strange peace in this endless repetition, a rhythm that was almost meditative. He started noticing details he had never paid attention to before, how the light on the mountainside changed throughout the day, the tiny wildflowers pushing through the stones, the feel of his muscles working in harmonious coordination to move the massive rock. He began to take pride not in reaching the summit, which he knew perfectly well was impossible, but in the quality of his effort, the unwavering tenacity of his resolve. Some philosophers have suggested that in his eternal task, Sisyphus discovered something that had eluded him in his cunning, scheming life. The satisfaction that comes not from outsmarting others or achieving impossible victories, but from simply performing one's work with dignity and persistence, regardless of the outcome. Perhaps the true punishment was not the endless toil, but the realization of what his life could have been if he had earlier learned to find meaning in the process itself, rather than fixating solely on results. Or perhaps the punishment gradually transformed into a kind of gift, a chance to discover that even in the most hopeless situation, one can find purpose and even satisfaction. The myth of Sisyphus serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the very qualities we mistakenly believe make us superior, our cunning, our ability to find loopholes and shortcuts, our determination to win at all costs, can become the sources of our greatest suffering. And sometimes the tasks that seem most meaningless are precisely those that teach us the most about what truly matters. Each of us has our own boulders to push, our own hills to climb, our own tasks that seem to start over just when we think we're making progress. The question is not whether we will succeed in the way we initially hoped, but whether we will find a way to push our stone with dignity, with conscious purpose, and perhaps even with joy. Finding joy in inherently impossible circumstances is something Daedalus understood better than most, though his own story starkly illustrates that sometimes the very solutions we devise to escape our problems can become the source of even greater tragedy. His narrative is a saga of genius and love, of innovation and profound loss, and of the terrible weight of unintended consequences. Daedalus was the greatest inventor and craftsman who ever lived. His skilled hands could shape any material into any form he could imagine, and his fertile imagination seemed to have no bounds. He created mechanical servants capable of performing complex tasks, fountains that played melodies as water flowed through them, and sculptures so lifelike that people spoke to them, expecting a reply. His workshop was a true marvel of unfinished projects and brilliant innovations. Gears and pulleys hung from the ceiling next to sketches of flying machines. Workbenches were cluttered with models of buildings defying traditional architecture, devices capable of measuring time or predicting weather, toys that moved on their own as if alive. But Daedalus's greatest creation was not a machine or a magnificent building. It was his son, Icarus. Not literally created, of course, but shaped and moulded by years of patient teaching and gentle, wise guidance. Icarus possessed his father's curiosity and keen mind, though he lacked the patience and the wisdom that comes with age. One can easily imagine them working together in the workshop, Daedalus showing his son how to join pieces of wood in a way that they would never come apart, how to temper metal to achieve perfect sharpness, how to observe the flight of birds and grasp the principles that kept them aloft. Icarus listened intently, his young face serious with concentration, asking endless questions about why things worked the way they did. Their peaceful life was disrupted when King Minos of Crete summoned Daedalus to his court. The king had a serious problem. His wife had given birth to a monster called the Minotaur, half man and half bull, and he needed a place to keep it securely confined. Not to kill it, mind you, but to imprison it in such a way that it would not terrorize his people, yet could continue to live. Daedalus designed and built a labyrinth so complex and intricate that anyone who entered it would become hopelessly lost. Passages twisted and turned back on themselves, led to dead ends, opened into chambers that seemed to offer an exit, but actually led deeper into the labyrinth's depths. In its center, the Minotaur lived in a kind of peaceful captivity, fed and cared for, but utterly unable to find its way out. The labyrinth was a true masterpiece of engineering and psychology, accounting not only for the physical challenge of navigation, but also for the mental effects of prolonged confusion and disorientation. It was designed not merely as an impregnable fortress, but to make anyone trapped inside gradually lose all hope of finding freedom. For several years, Daedalus and Icarus lived comfortably on Crete. As honored guests of King Minos, Daedalus continued his prolific work, creating new inventions and solving complex problems for the royal court. Icarus, meanwhile, grew from a boy into a young man, mastering his father's skills and developing his own interests and talents. But then something happened that forever changed their fate. The hero Theseus arrived on Crete, and with the help of the king's daughter Ariadne, managed to navigate the labyrinth, kill the Minotaur, and safely escape the island. King Minos was beside himself with rage, not only at the loss of the Minotaur, but also at the realization that in his opinion, perfect prison had been defeated. In his anger, Minos blamed Daedalus for the labyrinth's failure. How else could Theseus have succeeded if the labyrinth's creator had not somehow divulged its secrets? The accusation was deeply unfair. Daedalus had nothing to do with Theseus's success. But justice was not something King Minos particularly cared about when consumed by rage. As punishment, Minos imprisoned Daedalus and Icarus in a tall tower situated on a small island off the coast of Crete. The tower was isolated and rose above the water on all sides with no boats and no possibility of swimming to safety. The king naively believed that even the great inventor Daedalus would be unable to escape from such an impregnable prison. For several weeks, father and son lived in their tower, subsisting on simple food brought to them once a day, watching the sun rise and set through the single window, wondering if they would spend the rest of their lives in confinement. Daedalus spent his time studying the birds that nested in the tower walls, carefully observing how they used their wings to glide on air currents, and how they could stay aloft for hours without tiring. Icarus, a youth full of vital energy, felt deeply disturbed by his forced confinement. Accustomed to constant activity, participating in various projects, and acquiring new knowledge, he found idleness almost more tormenting than the captivity itself. His days were spent aimlessly pacing the cramped chamber, gazing for hours at the world outside the window, and incessantly questioning his father about their imminent release and possible escape routes. It was during one of these prolonged, silent days that Daedalus, the ingenious craftsman, had an epiphany. His gaze fixed on a seagull majestically soaring outside the window, barely moving its wings, rising on the warm updrafts from the rocks below. Suddenly, he realized the solution. "We cannot leave this place by foot," he said to Icarus, "and we cannot leave by sea, but there is a path Minos has not closed, the sky itself." Beginning his work, Daedalus used all available materials found both in their chamber and within the tower itself. He started constructing 2 pairs of wings. For this, he collected feathers shed by the birds nesting in the structure's walls. From the tiniest downy feathers to the long, sturdy primary feathers providing necessary lift and control, each feather was meticulously selected. The process of creating the wings demanded exceptional skill and boundless patience from Daedalus. Each feather had to be precisely positioned and secured with thread unravelled from their clothes, and wax melted from the candles that illuminated their dwelling. The wings had to be light enough for flight, yet strong enough to bear the weight of a human body, flexible enough to respond to air currents, yet stiff enough to provide stable lift. Icarus assisted in the creation process, but it was evident that his heart was not fully engaged in this meticulous, methodical work. He was burning with impatience to try the wings, to test their functionality, to feel the incomparable freedom of flight. While his father carefully checked every joint and tested every articulation, Icarus dreamed of soaring high above the island, of the feeling of wind beneath his wings, of the exhilaration of an aerial escape from their prison. When the wings were finally ready, Daedalus dedicated an entire day to teaching his son the art of controlling them. They practiced on the chamber floor, mastering arm movements to create lift, learning to shift their weight for turns, and reading the signs indicating wind direction. "Remember," Daedalus tirelessly repeated, "fly at a moderate height, not too low so that sea spray does not dampen and weigh down your wings, but also not too high, for the sun's heat will melt the wax holding the feathers together. Stay close to me, follow my path, and do not try to be overly clever or boastful. This is about survival, not adventure." Icarus nodded, solemnly promising to follow his father's instructions precisely. However, even as he made these promises, his eyes held an undisguised excitement, barely contained impatience to experience what no human had achieved before him. The morning chosen for their escape proved ideal for flying. Clear skies, a moderate breeze, excellent visibility in all directions. Daedalus helped his son attach the wings, carefully rechecking all fastenings, and then put on his own. For a moment, they paused together at their tower window, father and son, preparing to do something that defied all laws of nature. The first moments of flight were truly magical. The wings functioned exactly as Daedalus had intended, catching the air and lifting them upwards, away from their tower prison. Below, the island of Crete spread out like a detailed map, with its harbours and cities, mountains and valleys, all appearing peaceful and miniature from their elevated vantage point. Icarus laughed with pure joy, feeling weightless in the air. This was freedom beyond his wildest dreams, the ability to move anywhere, to see the world from an entirely new perspective, to move in 3 dimensions instead of being bound to the earth like any other human. For a while, everything went according to plan. Father and son flew steadily from Crete, maintaining a moderate altitude, following the route Daedalus had carefully planned over many weeks. They flew over small islands, past fishing boats and merchant vessels, whose crews pointed at them in astonishment. However, gradually, excitement and exhilaration began to overpower Icarus's caution. The sensation of flight was so incredible, so intoxicating, that he yearned to experience it even more. He began to experiment, rising higher, diving lower, performing turns and loops his father had never taught him. Daedalus shouted warnings, trying to get his son's attention, reminding him of the dangers of flying too high or too low, but his voice was lost in the wind, and Icarus was too absorbed in the joy of flight to pay attention to anything else. Higher and higher Icarus soared, drawn by the warmth of the sun and the incredible view that opened up as he gained altitude. the world below became a picturesque patchwork of blues, greens, and browns, inexpressibly beautiful. He felt as if he was seeing infinity, that he was grasping secrets of the earth that no mortal could ever know. In his excitement, Icarus did not notice that the wax holding his wings together had begun to melt from the sun's heat. The feathers began to loosen, and then one by one they detached. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. The wings that had so triumphantly carried him into the sky began to fall apart, feathers scattered in the wind like snow, and suddenly Icarus found himself falling, no longer supported by the artificial wings his father had so carefully crafted. Daedalus, flying lower, looked up just in time to see his son plummeting into the sea. He was helpless. He could not fly fast enough to catch him. He could not repair the damaged wings in mid-air. He could not prevent the tragedy unfolding above him. Icarus plunged into the blue waters of the Aegean Sea, and the waves closed over him as if he had never existed. The only remaining traces were a few scattered feathers floating on the surface and the sound of a father's desperate cry echoing across the empty sky. Daedalus landed on the nearest island, removed his wings, and for several days searched the shore for any sign of his son. Eventually, Icarus's body washed ashore, and Daedalus buried him there with his own hands, erecting a monument to commemorate the place where the first human to fly fell to earth. The story of Daedalus and Icarus serves as a powerful reminder that every gift comes with responsibility, and every freedom has its limits. The very thing that can save us, be it our intellect, our creativity, or our courage, can also cause our downfall if we do not respect its power and understand its boundaries. Sometimes the most dangerous moment comes not when we are struggling with our limitations, but when we have just broken free from them and feel that anything is possible. It is in such moments that we most need wisdom, and it is then that it is often hardest to remember that even the sky has limits that we cross at our peril. The boundaries we cross often seem insignificant at the moment, like a simple choice between three beautiful gifts, but they can set in motion a chain of events that will change the entire world. This was certainly true for a young shepherd named Paris, who made a decision that seemed easy enough at the time, but ultimately led to the launching of 1,000 ships and the destruction of 2 great cities. Paris was not meant to make fateful decisions. In fact, he wasn't supposed to be alive at all. When he was born to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, the royal seers predicted that this infant would one day cause the destruction of Troy. The prophecy was so terrible, so specific, that the king and queen felt they had no choice but to order the baby killed. But the servant entrusted with killing the child could not bring himself to commit the murder of an innocent infant. Instead, he left Paris on Mount Ida, hoping that the elements would do what he could not. It was meant to be a more merciful death than outright murder, but death nonetheless. Paris, however, did not perish. He was found and raised by shepherds living on the slopes of the mountain, simple people who were strangers to prophecies or royal politics. They raised him as their own son, teaching him to tend sheep, read weather signs, find shelter in storms, and lead the quiet, uncomplicated life of a shepherd. For 20 years, Paris lived in peaceful ignorance of his true identity. He believed himself to be merely the son of another shepherd, and was quite content with this station. He spent his days watching over flocks of sheep and goats, playing his pipes while the animals grazed, sleeping under the stars when the weather was mild, and taking refuge in simple huts when storms swept across the mountain. It was a life without luxury, but also without the burdens and responsibilities that accompany power. Paris was strong from his outdoor work, handsome, as young men leading healthy, active lives often are, and possessed a natural charm that made animals and people instinctively trust him. Then one day, as Paris was tending his flocks in a peaceful meadow high on Mount Ida, 3 figures appeared before him, who were certainly not shepherds, nor travellers, nor anyone else one would expect to encounter in such a remote place. They were the 3 most powerful goddesses of the Greek pantheon: Hera, queen of the gods and patroness of marriage; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each was magnificent beyond human description, radiating power and divinity in a way that made it impossible to mistake them for mortals. But despite their undeniable majesty, the 3 goddesses seemed to be embroiled in a fierce dispute. They spoke in sharp, tense voices, gesticulating actively, each striving to assert her own ignored right. The root of their discord was a golden fruit clutched in Hera's hand. On its glossy surface gleamed the inscription, "To the fairest," and it had appeared among them during a lavish wedding feast, cast by the cunning Eris, goddess of discord, whose indignation was provoked by her exclusion from the celebration. Naturally, each of the goddesses was convinced that she was the fairest and, therefore, the rightful owner of this gift, but none was willing to yield precedence to a rival, and their arguments had dragged on to such an extent that there was a real threat of disrupting the very harmony of sacred Olympus, shaking its ancient peace. At this critical moment, the lord of Olympus himself, Zeus, intervened, not to personally resolve this conflict, for that would have forced him to choose between his own wife, beloved daughter, and half-sister, but to delegate the right of judgment to a mortal arbiter, whose decision could not be tainted by suspicions of partiality or divine favoritism. "You," Hera proclaimed, imperiously pointing to Paris. The young man, who was still stunned, mouth agape, trying to comprehend the incredible events unfolding before his eyes. "You are to determine which of us is rightfully the most deserving owner of this golden apple." Paris's gaze darted from one goddess to another. His ordinary pastoral common sense clearly whispered to him that he was facing precisely the dilemma any sensible person would seek to avoid. For how could one choose between 3 powerful beings capable of incinerating him with a mere thought if the verdict displeased them? "I am but a humble shepherd," Paris murmured faintly. "Surely there is someone more knowledgeable, more worthy." "The decision has already been made," Athena sharply interrupted him. "Zeus himself has appointed you as arbiter. You have no right to refuse." And then followed not so much a contest of beauty as a series of increasingly seductive promises and outright attempts at bribery. Each of the goddesses, realizing that this simple mortal shepherd had gained incredible, almost boundless power over their immortal reputations and glory, began to offer him gifts capable of transforming his humble life beyond recognition, elevating him above all mortals. First to speak was Hera, her voice imbued with the unmistakable authority befitting the queen of the gods. "Choose me," she declared, "and I will grant you dominion over all of Europe and Asia, making you the undisputed ruler of these lands. You will lead countless armies, wisely govern great cities, and be remembered by future generations as one of the greatest monarchs ever to walk the earth. No mortal will dare or be able to oppose you." Truly, it was a breathtaking offer. In his imagination, Paris already saw himself clad in shining golden armor, standing at the gates of conquered cities, accepting the humble submission of vanquished foes. He envisioned scenes where he enacted wise laws, patronized the creation of magnificent works of art and architecture, leaving behind a legacy that would live on for ages through millennia. However, before Paris could utter a word, Athena stepped forward. "Power without wisdom is empty and meaningless," she proclaimed. "Choose me, and I will endow you with wisdom surpassing that of any mortal, and I will grant you unwavering victory in every battle you ever wage. You will become an invincible warrior, unmatched in strategic art, and will be remembered not merely as a great conqueror, but as the wisest of all rulers who ever existed." This promise proved even more tempting than Hera's generous offer. For what good is boundless power if one lacks the knowledge to wield it wisely and beneficently? What would become of a ruler who, possessing a throne, made unwise decisions that doomed his people to suffering? With Athena's gifts, Paris could become not just a successful leader, but a truly great and revered ruler. But then Aphrodite illuminated everything with her smile, as dazzling and desirable as a sunbeam breaking through thick clouds after a prolonged thunderstorm. "My sisters promise you what will bring only burden and heavy responsibility," she said softly but persuasively. "Choose me, and I will grant you something far simpler, yet incomparably more precious: the love of the most beautiful woman in the entire world. Helen of Sparta will be yours, and with her will come such happiness as neither earthly power nor the greatest wisdom can provide." Paris, of course, had heard of Helen. Even the simplest shepherds recounted tales of the Spartan queen whose beauty was so exceptional that it bordered on the supernatural, the divine. Poets dedicated immortal verses to her, artists sought to capture her elusive image on their canvases, and youths throughout Hellas cherished the dream of at least a glimpse of her. For Paris, the choice seemed obvious. Power and wisdom were undoubtedly impressive gifts, but they carried the burden of obligations and inevitable complexities. Helen, on the other hand, embodied love in its most unadulterated, purest form, the joy that comes from finding a kindred spirit capable of complementing you, whose mere presence brightens every new day. Paris gave no thought to the fact that Helen was already married to the powerful king of Sparta, Menelaus. His mind was not burdened by thoughts of the potential consequences when the most beautiful woman in the world suddenly vanished from her homeland. He did not bother to question why Aphrodite could even make such a promise, or what price its fulfillment might entail. All his thoughts were consumed only by love, beauty, and the serene happiness that seemed to sparkle in Aphrodite's eyes, foreshadowing all that he had never even dared to hope for. "My choice is Aphrodite," Paris declared firmly, and the golden apple of beauty passed into the hands of the goddess of love. The consequences of this fateful decision were not long in coming, resulting in immediate and devastating catastrophe. Hera and Athena, enraged by such a blatant disregard for their dignity, swore to become implacable enemies of Paris, and in essence, of the entire city of Troy. Without a moment's delay, they began to devise sinister plans for the complete destruction of the city that had produced this audacious shepherd, who dared to deem them less worthy than the goddess of love. Aphrodite, ever true to her promise, skillfully arranged for Paris to soon travel to Sparta, where he was cordially received as an honored guest by King Menelaus. During Paris's stay in Sparta, Helen, under the influence of divine magic, fell deeply and passionately in love with the handsome young guest, precisely as the goddess of love had foretold. However, love born of divine intervention and magic differs strikingly from the feeling that naturally arises and strengthens between two people. It possesses greater intensity, overwhelming force, and much less regard for consequences or moral responsibility. Helen abandoned her husband, her young daughter, and her kingdom to depart with Paris for Troy, never once looking back at all she left behind. When Menelaus realized that his wife had been treacherously abducted by his Trojan guest, his grief and fury knew no bounds. However, he was not alone in his righteous anger. Even before Helen had tied her fate to Menelaus, virtually all the princes and kings of Greece had vied for her hand and heart, and all her former suitors had sworn to protect her marriage and assist her future husband if anyone ever dared to abduct her. This oath, which then seemed merely a formality, now served as the foundation for the creation of the grandest military alliance the ancient world had ever known. One by one, the kings and renowned heroes of Hellas, true to their word, began to fulfill their obligation, assembling countless armies and fleets for what would later go down in history as the legendary Trojan War. For 10 long years, Greek forces besieged Troy, and this war, sparked by Paris's seemingly insignificant choice, ruthlessly consumed an entire generation of people. Great heroes fell on the battlefields, flourishing cities were razed to the ground, families were separated and torn apart, and the very delicate fabric of Eastern Mediterranean civilization was ripped to shreds. Ultimately, Troy fell, precisely as ancient prophecies had foretold. King Priam met his demise, Queen Hecuba was enslaved, and the magnificent city that had stood proudly for centuries was reduced to charred, smoking ruins. Paris himself met his death in battle, struck down by an arrow that reached him at the very moment he, perhaps, began to realize the true, monstrous cost of the choice he had made in that serene meadow many years ago. The narrative of the judgment of Paris serves as an eternal reminder that some decisions, which at the moment of their making seem insignificant and purely personal, are capable of generating consequences that extend far beyond anything a mortal mind can imagine. When a person makes a choice guided only by momentary desires and without considering the vast, long-term consequences of their actions, they risk unleashing destructive forces capable of annihilating not only themselves but also everyone around them. Sometimes the most important thing in any choice is not what we ultimately gain, but what we are willing to sacrifice for it, and whether we have considered the true cost of that sacrifice for other people who never had the opportunity to voice their opinion in our decision. The echoes of suffering of those who fell victim to others' decisions resonate ceaselessly through the ages, and nowhere is this more strikingly evident than in the final chapter of the Trojan War, when a city that had heroically withstood a 10-year siege was ultimately destroyed not by superior force or unparalleled bravery, but by an elaborate, treacherous deception, which inevitably makes one wonder, can a victory won through treacherous deception truly be considered a victory? By the 10th year of the war that Paris had inadvertently sparked, both warring sides were utterly exhausted and depleted. Greek warriors had spent a decade in camps on foreign beaches, stretched out beneath the walls of Troy. Far from their homes and families, growing old in a foreign land, they waged a seemingly endless war. The Trojans, in turn, had been confined within their city walls for just as long, watching their food supplies inexorably dwindle and their young warriors perish in countless battles one after another. The famous heroes whose deeds gave the early years of the war such dramatic intensity had by this point mostly perished. The invincible Achilles had fallen, struck by Paris's arrow in his sole vulnerable heel. Hector, Troy's greatest defender, had been killed by Achilles in furious revenge for Patroclus's death. Mighty Ajax had taken his own life, gripped by a fit of madness and unbearable shame. Even Paris himself had vanished from the battlefield, his death barely noticed amidst a string of far more significant losses. What remained were tired, grizzled soldiers, whose only wish was to return home, under the command of generals who had invested too much in this protracted war to simply abandon it, but who now struggled to remember why they ever thought this battle was worth all the sacrifices. The Greek camp, spread out beneath the walls of legendary Troy, had, over years of siege, transformed into a kind of semi-permanent settlement. It was no longer merely a military encampment, but a small city of tents and hastily erected temporary structures, bustling with its own life, markets, workshops, and a clearly defined social hierarchy. Warriors who had once arrived on foreign soil, young and full of vigor, were now greying veterans whose children grew up at home without ever seeing their fathers. Many had fallen victim to disease or accidents, while others died from wounds that, in the unsanitary conditions of military life, never properly healed. Inside Troy, the situation was even more dire. The once prosperous and proud city was now overflowing with refugees from surrounding lands. All these people sought refuge behind mighty walls that, paradoxically, had become both their reliable protection and a harsh prison. Food was rationed, fuel was critically scarce, and every inhabitant lived under the constant pressure of knowing that enemies were just outside the walls, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. King Priam, Troy's steadfast ruler, had visibly aged during the prolonged siege. The man who once exuded energy and authority was now bent by the burden of grief and exhaustion. He had lost so many sons that he sometimes struggled to remember which of them were still alive. Queen Hecuba, like a ghost, glided through the palace halls, her face reflecting the unbearable weight of watching her family and her beloved city slowly fade around her. Yet, despite all their suffering, the Trojans showed no hint of surrender. Their walls remained impregnable, their few remaining soldiers continued to fight bravely, and their spirit, though battered by the hardships of war, remained unyielding. As long as these magnificent walls stood, Troy could hold out indefinitely, and the Greeks would never be able to claim the complete and unconditional victory for which they had sacrificed so much. It was Odysseus, the wise king of Ithaca and the most cunning of all Greek commanders, who finally devised a plan to end this protracted conflict. For months he had meticulously studied the problem, seeking a way to get Greek soldiers into the city without resorting to a direct assault on its impregnable fortifications. The solution, when it finally came to him, struck him with its elegant simplicity. Instead of trying to break into Troy by force, why not trick the Trojans into voluntarily letting the Greek warriors inside? Odysseus proposed building a massive wooden horse, hollow inside and large enough to conceal a select group of Greek fighters. This horse would be presented to the Trojans as a religious offering, a gift to the gods, intended to ensure the Greeks' safe return home after they abandoned their siege. Odysseus's plan required the Greeks to completely evacuate their camp, sailing away under cover of night, as if they had finally admitted defeat. The next morning the Trojans would discover a deserted beach, save for the mysterious wooden horse, and perhaps a single left-behind Greek to explain its purpose. The construction of the horse took several weeks. Greek carpenters and engineers worked on it in strict secrecy, making it large enough to appear imposing as a religious offering, but with a hidden compartment capable of holding 30 of their best warriors. The horse was artfully crafted to look like a masterpiece of workmanship, a kind of gift that the gods might truly appreciate. When the horse was ready, Odysseus personally selected the men who would hide inside it. He chose not only experienced fighters but also men with strong nerves, capable of maintaining complete silence and stillness for long hours. These warriors would have to endure confinement inside the wooden structure, unable to see what was happening outside, relying entirely on the success of the plan for their own survival. On the appointed night, the Greek army broke camp and boarded their ships, sailing into the deepest dark as if they had finally given up their 10-year siege. However, they did not head home. Instead, they anchored behind a nearby island, awaiting a signal that would tell them if their ingenious deception had worked. When dawn illuminated Troy, the first thing the sentries noticed was the unaccustomed silence. For 10 years they had grown used to the constant sounds of the Greek camp, the clang of weapons, the voices of soldiers, the smoke from campfires. Now there was nothing but the sound of waves lapping against the empty beach. Cautiously, a few Trojan scouts ventured outside the city walls to reconnoiter. What they discovered seemed too incredible to be true. The Greek camp was completely abandoned, with only scattered debris to show that anyone had ever been there. But on the deserted beach stood a massive wooden horse, beautifully made and clearly intended as some kind of offering. Next to the horse, the scouts found a lone Greek soldier named Sinon, who had apparently been left behind by his departing comrades. Under interrogation, Sinon recounted a carefully rehearsed story about how the Greeks had finally decided to abandon the siege and return home. But first they wanted to make a sacrifice to ensure their safe passage. The horse, Sinon explained, was dedicated to Athena, and it had been deliberately built too large to pass through Troy's gates. The Greeks, he claimed, hoped that the Trojans would try to bring it into the city, which would anger the goddess and bring her wrath down upon Troy. By leaving the horse outside, the Trojans would be safe, and the Greeks would earn Athena's favor for their journey home. It was a cunning story, designed to make the Trojans do exactly what the Greeks hoped. By implying that bringing the horse inside would be dangerous, Sinon made it seem as if defying Greek expectations would be an act of wisdom and bravery. The Trojans debated heatedly for hours about what to do with this mysterious horse. Some, including the priest Laocoon, argued that it was clearly some kind of trick and should be destroyed immediately. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts," Laocoon warned. But his wise counsel was ignored when he was killed by sea serpents, which many interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure with his words. Others insisted that the horse was a valuable religious artifact that should be brought into the city and dedicated in one of Troy's temples. After all, if the Greeks had truly given up and sailed away, what harm could there be in taking their abandoned offering? In the end, curiosity and hope triumphed over caution. The Trojans decided to bring the horse into their city, even though it meant partially dismantling their gates and walls, the very fortifications that had protected them for 10 long years. The process took most of the day. The horse was so enormous that teams of oxen were required to drag it through the city streets, and crowds gathered to marvel at this strange trophy of their apparent victory. Children ran around the massive wooden structure, and adults reached out to touch it, as if contact with this symbol of Greek defeat could somehow make their triumph more real. That night, Troy celebrated as it had not celebrated in a decade. The gates that had been closed for 10 years were thrown open. Wine, which had been carefully rationed, flowed freely, and people danced in the streets until exhaustion finally sent them to bed. But inside the wooden horse, 30 Greek warriors waited in absolute silence, listening as the sounds of celebration gradually faded into deep sleep. When they judged the city to be fully asleep, they carefully opened the secret panel that allowed them to exit. One by one, the Greek soldiers descended from their hiding place and crept through the sleeping city to the gates. There they overcame the few drowsy guards and signaled to their comrades waiting on ships beyond the nearby island. The Greek army, which the Trojans thought had sailed away forever, surged back, pouring through the gates that their hidden warriors had opened for them. By the time most Trojans realized what was happening, their city was already lost. What followed was not a battle, but a ruthless massacre. The Greeks, filled with 10 years of frustration and grief, showed no mercy to the people who had cost them so much time and so many lives. They killed not only soldiers attempting to resist, but also civilians who had no part in starting or prolonging the war. King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus, where he sought refuge. Queen Hecuba was taken into slavery, forced to watch the destruction of everything she had ever loved. Princess Cassandra, who had prophesied Troy's fall but was never believed, was dragged from the temple where she sought protection. The city that had stood for centuries was burned to the ground in a single night. The walls that had seemed so impregnable were torn down stone by stone. Temples were plundered, palaces destroyed, and the homes of ordinary people reduced to ash and rubble. By morning, Troy was no more, not just defeated, but utterly erased from the earth, as if it had never existed. The story of the Trojan Horse reminds us that sometimes our greatest victories come not from strength or bravery, but from our enemies' willingness to believe what they want to believe, rather than what they ought to fear. The Trojans brought destruction into their own city because they so desperately wanted to believe that their long nightmare was finally over. It also shows us that the methods we use to achieve victory matter almost as much as the victory itself. The Greeks won their war, but they won it through deception and betrayal, and the hollow feeling of such a triumph echoed in their stories for generations afterward. Sometimes, when we get what we want through means we are not proud of, we find that success feels nothing like we thought it would. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that wars, no matter how they begin or who wins them, always end with ordinary people paying the price for decisions made by others long ago and far away. The fall of Troy represented not merely the conclusion of a prolonged military conflict, but the complete annihilation of an entire community, a rich culture, and countless individual fates. These thousands of souls had absolutely no connection to the fateful decision made by Paris in that meadow at the foot of Mount Ida, yet they fully experienced all the catastrophic consequences of that ancient choice.